So my name is Dr. Camilla Clark, and I'm doing a PhD at the Dementia Research Centre with Professor Warren. And I'm going to talk to you today about just an overview of the disease and frontotemporal dementia. And my PhD is specifically in frontotemporal dementia syndromes. And so first of all, I thought I'd talk about what is dementia. So everyone's brain shrinks as they get older. So a normal 90-year-old lady's brain will be smaller than a 70-year-old, which will be smaller than a 50-year-old's. But what happens in dementia is because of abnormal proteins being laid down in the brain, then this process is accelerated. And so depending on what type of dementia it is, so Alzheimer's disease versus frontotemporal dementia, there are different types of proteins laid down in different regions of the brain, which leads to different problems. Because the proteins interfere with the neural transmission, and that area becomes damaged and then shrinks and doesn't work properly. And so whatever function that part of the brain was responsible for, it can no longer do that function. And those are the symptoms that we see in the diseases. And so why does this happen in the first place? Like most diseases, it's a combination of genetics and environment. And some people, the genetic loading is so strong that whatever happens in your environment, you will develop the disease. And in other people, they don't seem to have a genetic tendency, but it's just for whatever reason in the environment, they develop the disease. And there's a lot of work going into what it is in the environment that causes people to develop these diseases. And so the most common dementia that most people know about is Alzheimer's disease, which is 2/3 of the dementia that we see. And that's a memory-led syndrome. But as all of you know, frontotemporal dementia is quite different. So it's a very targeted dementia that targets specific parts of the brain, and therefore the problems are very specific. And actually memory often isn't a major feature of the disease. And it's these other areas that we're going to speak about today. And so frontotemporal dementia, someone's nose would be here, so looking towards me. And so the front part of the brain, so this part, is responsible for your emotion, your behavior, your social skills, planning. And the temporal lobes, which are this bit that juts out here, and you've got one on either side, but because the person's looking effectively towards me, then the other one's hidden. So the left side, in most right-handed people, is responsible for language, and the right side is responsible for behavior. And so depending on where the damage starts and which of the syndromes it is, that will determine what problems people have. And so this is a brain of someone with frontotemporal dementia. And you can see, as I was saying, with these abnormal proteins being laid down in the front and the temporal lobes, then compared to a normal brain, they're shrunken away. And so that will be, those parts of the brain won't be working properly because of the damage that has caused the shrinkage. And then we'll have the problems that we see with the disease. And so the main types of frontotemporal dementia can be divided into the behavioral type or the language types. And so the language types are called primary progressive aphasia, so progressive meaning getting worse over time, and aphasia meaning language problems. And there's actually a third one which can be associated with Alzheimer's disease, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, and that's logopenic progressive aphasia. And then there's the non-fluent form, and then semantic dementia. And so we'll talk about all of these in more detail, but I'll start with the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia. And so this is previously known as Pick's disease, so some of you might know it as that. And so this is where someone's social skills are affected and profoundly affected. And so the reason that we can interact so easily with the people around us is because we have an ability called mentalizing or theory of mind. So we can work out, and children will develop this quite early on, what someone is thinking or feeling without necessarily having to be told what they're thinking and feeling. And this ability is lost with the disease. And so people can appear emotionally disconnected and not seeming to connect as well with those they love and those around them. And with this, because of the damage to the front part of the brain, which is responsible for our inhibition, so when we think something may be rude about someone or inappropriate, but it'll come down and we might not necessarily say it, then because that part of the brain's damaged, then these thoughts will just be expressed. So there won't be that sort of thought of this might have a negative impact on the person it's said to. And there's also the front part of the brain is responsible for flexibility of thinking. So to be able to change strategy, or if something's not working, to switch to something else. And that is also affected. So people can become quite rigid and inflexible with times of meals, or if our clinic's running late or things like that, you've just got less capacity to accept that and to be able to just be flexible. And so unfortunately it's the people around them who have to be the flexible ones, because with the disease they just won't be able to do it. And so, and the part of the brain that's affected is also responsible for our insight. And so often with these diseases, then actually the behavioural type people aren't really aware of what's going on and don't have that awareness that they're emotionally not quite connecting. And so it can be, this is actually really difficult for the families to deal with this aspect of the disease. As some of you know, then there's often an alteration in food habits, and so people can develop a very sweet tooth and be craving sweet food and cakes. And as I said, that because it's this very targeted group of diseases, then actually, unlike Alzheimer's disease, memory is actually unaffected, often until very, very late. And so people do really, really well on our memory tests, which actually makes it quite difficult to diagnose, because with Alzheimer's disease, we rely on the memory test for diagnosis. And it means, particularly with this type, then people can often be left undiagnosed for quite some time, because behaviour is so difficult to quantify, and particularly social behaviour is really difficult to measure and to say that this is normal, this is abnormal. And so this is part of what we're researching into, is trying to find ways of measuring it.
So. We move on from here. Does language reside in any way in the right temporal lobe? Is there any language in a right-handed person?
It can do if you're left-handed. Some people will have it, and so because the brain's reversed, then right-handed people tend to be in the left side, and left-handed people can have it in both sides, but it can be in the right. And so this is, the red area shows damage, and so this is at the start of the disease. It'll start, and often it can do in the right temporal pole, just this very tip. And that's also where facial recognition is housed. So sometimes people will say that with the behavioural variant of frontotemporal dementia, that they seem unable to recognise faces in the same way. And that's anatomically because that's the area we rely on to recognise faces. So that may be a feature you've noticed with the disease. And then over time, then it spreads to the neighbouring areas and will spread upwards and across ways. And so neighbouring regions can start to be affected later in the disease. So sometimes it'll start off very focused, but then involve other areas that weren't involved right at the beginning. And so I was going to talk a bit now about the non-fluent form, so one of the language syndromes. And so progressive non-fluent aphasia is difficulty with speech production, but there's no difficulty with speech understanding for a long, long time with the condition. And so it's very, very frustrating for those people who have it, because they know what they want to say and they can understand everything said to them, and they just can't get the words out as they want to get out. It'll either be very, very effortful and stuttering, or sometimes the wrong sound of a word will come out. So a word that sounds like the word they were trying to say, which, particularly if it is actually another word, can be quite confusing for the listener. But the important thing to remember is that the understanding is there. And so you don't need to modify how you say things because they'll be able to understand it, but it's just the patience with how they get their message transmitted across. And so speech and language therapy are often quite involved with helping us with communication aids and using writing. And lots of people who have this particular variant will walk around with a notepad and write what they want to say, because it's easier to do that than to try and verbalize it. The other feature of this condition, which is something new that hasn't particularly been noticed before, but it's one of these things that once you ask about it, more and more people tell you it's happening, is that those answers that we give, where there are two options, so yes, no, left, right, where you normally in answer to the question you have to choose one or the other, then because of the way language is mapped in the brain, that circuitry and that choice becomes faulty. So they'll say yes when they mean no, or no when they mean yes, and left and right can be reversed. And we're actually writing a paper on it now, because it's not been described before. And it's, again, very frustrating. So in a condition where output is really difficult anyway, then even if you're trying to give a one-word answer and the wrong answer comes out and you can't correct it. But I've spoken to some of the patients about it, and they say what they do to try and overcome it is often almost rehearsing the full sentence in their head. So even though it's more difficult to say the full sentence, end up trying to do that to get over this problem. The other thing is, because of the area affected, then grammar can be affected as well. So sometimes the wrong grammatical tense will come out just because of the way the language network works. And this can be seen in the writing as well. So the writing can start quite fluent, but then later on as the disease develops, sometimes, I don't know if anyone has noticed, but it can become what we call sort of telescoped. So the key words are still there, but they're not connected together in quite the fluent way that normally sentences would be constructed. And so this is someone, the brain of someone with PNFA showing where the damage is. And it's this fold in between the two lobes is where the problem is, and that's your motor output area. And then that can spread as a disease develops, and you can get some other features later on as well. And so semantic dementia is very different from progressive non-fluent aphasia. So here it's the output that's affected, but the understanding is actually full. Whereas in semantic dementia, it's your knowledge of words and knowledge of concepts is affected, but your fluency isn't affected. And so what happens is that as we go through life, you learn about things. So you learn what things are, what properties of things are, and you learn the word label that we've arbitrarily in society given to things. So you know things, a table, a chair, because that's what you've always known it as, and you know what properties those things have. And what happens with this disease, because of where that knowledge is housed in the left temporal lobe, then you initially with the disease, when it's very subtle, will lose those words that you don't use very much. And so the kind of what we call low frequency words. So complicated words, weird and wonderful words. But as the disease progresses, then you lose more and more frequent words. So they say it's like a tree where the outside leaves are being pruned, but then as you get closer, you get to more key branches. So we often have people come into clinic and they say that their relatives sat in a restaurant with them and said, "What's an asparagus?" And you know, they have known what an asparagus is, but suddenly that word's foreign to them. And the problem is, because the actual word has gone, then if you say, it's not like forgetting a word and someone presents you the word, you remember it, it's just gone. So if you say the word, they'll often behave like it's a foreign word and they haven't heard it before. But they can still maintain knowledge about that thing. So often if people, even if they've lost the word, there was someone that was saying in clinic, they didn't know what the word carrot was, but if they were shown a picture of a carrot, they could go to a supermarket and buy a carrot, but it was just the word was gone, so they weren't able to actually know the word. And so often in clinic, when we're trying to see whether we think someone has this loss of word knowledge, we get them to name these different items, all of which aren't that commonly used. So some of them might be able to pick up that they've forgotten what the word is. And if they've forgotten what the word is, then we try and give them clues or help them. But if that word's gone, our clues, or even starting saying squiff for squirrel, won't prompt people to remember it. And so that's some of the ways we get clues that those words have gone. The other thing is you go from very specific knowledge about something to quite general knowledge about things. And so the easiest way to illustrate this is the category of animals. And so this is someone who, as the disease progressed, was asked to draw a peacock. And so right at the top, you can see it's a very peacock-like picture of a peacock. All the features as you'd expect, and they obviously have a full awareness of, you know, what a peacock looks like and what it is. And then as the disease progresses and they're asked to draw a peacock again, you can see it's quite a generic hen-like bird that they've drawn, with a tail that is very peacock-like stuck on the end, but it's slightly less peacock-like than the first one. And right at the end of the disease, where they're quite severely affected, they're again asked to draw a peacock. And you can see they still have an awareness that a peacock is an animal. They probably would still know it's something living, but they've done a very generic, just four-legged animal, so probably don't know the difference between mammals and birds, but it's still got some semblance of a peacock tail. So that's an illustrative example of just the way our knowledge is built. And so you go from this very specific to quite general knowledge. And the other thing is that the speech, although very fluent, often becomes, because you're losing some of the words for objects, it becomes filled with quite empty phrases of things like that thing, or you know what I mean, or things like that, which will just replace the very specific word that you would want to use for that object. And so again, so this is the brain flipped the other way. So someone's nose would be pointing this way. So we're looking at the left here. And in semantic dementia, actually, it's quite surprising compared to the other conditions. So with someone with behavioral variant, you might look at the scan. Actually, it's normal for quite a long time, even though we're being told that they're not right with their social interactions. And it takes a while to watch to see the changes. Whereas semantic dementia is the opposite, that the damage is often quite severe before people come and tell us that there are problems. So you can see the damage is more extensive on this picture than some of the other ones. And then again, as the disease progresses, then it can spread and affect some of the frontal lobe as well. And so you can sometimes get some of the emotional changes that we see in the other diseases. And so this is just another type of scan looking at, so this is slicing the brain this way, acrossways, in the MRI scanner. And so these are the temporal lobes here. And so right in the middle here is, and here will be where your object knowledge and language is formed. And so you can see with both sides, you can compare. The grey bit's brain and the black bit's fluid around the brain. So if you're seeing a lot of black, it's because that part of brain's shrunken away and damaged. And you can see over time that it's progressed and then even starting to involve the other side. So at this stage, there might be some emotional changes, some rigid thinking that would occur in this patient, even though they started with just the language problems. And so I thought I'd mention logopenic progressive aphasia because this can be seen in frontotemporal dementia, but is also seen in Alzheimer's disease. And so logopenic is sort of few words, and progressive, again, getting more pronounced over time. And so they present with word-finding difficulties to us, but it's very different from the semantic dementia word-finding difficulties. So the reason a semantic dementia patient can't find the word is because it's not there anymore. Whereas with logopenic patients, what's happened is their word store is fine, but the way we access that word store is broken. So they can't find the words because they can't just get to them. But if we gave them the word, they'd recognize the word, they'd know exactly what we were talking about. So when they have word-finding difficulties and you say, do you mean whatever the word is, then they'll recognize it, know what it is, because it's just they can't access it. But obviously when you're speaking, you're constantly pulling out different words from your word store. So when they speak, there's a lot of pauses as they're trying to sort of fish out the different words. The other thing that's affected is that we have a buffer in our brains that holds information for a short period of time that you don't really need to encode to long-term memories, but just enough to think of what you're going to say next. Or if you're trying to remember a telephone number long enough to walk across the room to the telephone, you can just hold that 7-digit number for long enough to do it, and then you forget it again. And so that buffer area is affected and not as effective in this disease. And so we'll often test them in clinic by giving them longer and longer words and then longer and longer phrases to remember. And they'll, early in the disease, we'll have to give very long phrases, and then suddenly they won't be able to do it anymore. And as the disease progresses, then moderately long phrases will be difficult to remember. And the problem is that obviously when you're speaking, you're constantly relying on having things just a little bit ahead of yourself to be so you know where you're going. And so this also contributes to the pauses and difficulty. And also if they're being asked to remember a lot of information in one go in order to make a decision or to remember it for some purpose, they'll find that really difficult. So sort of shorter and more contained bits of information is easier as well for that reason. And so with this condition, because it's particularly the Alzheimer's disease variant can be a bit more spread out in the brain, you can get other areas affected, so the parietal lobes, which do arithmetic and coordination of body movements, and you can have other features of these diseases, so slightly more spread out. And so again, this is sort of early on versus late on. You can see, and again, as in all these conditions, it's this pattern of spread from the damaged area to the neighboring area. So you have this bit of damage that, for whatever reason, happens. And then some people have said it's almost like an infectious spread, just spreads to the next bit of brain, damages that, and then the next bit of brain and damages that. And there's lots and lots of work going into what it is, what actually transmits to do that damage. And if we can stop the spread, then it seems to just spread from a focus and then spread out. So if you can contain that initial focus, then we could do a lot to managing disease. So that's where, and Professor Warren's doing quite a lot of work on this with the networks of disease. Because the other thing you might have noticed or know about is the patterns tend to be quite similar between the different diseases. So on the scan, then 2 semantic dementia scans will look quite similar, and 2 behavioural variant patient scans will look quite similar. And we want to know what it is that means that one person gets one disease, another person gets another disease, but each disease is very contained in this very repeated pattern. Like, why is that part of the brain vulnerable in that same way again and again in different people? And so a lot of the work is going on looking at that at the moment. And so I thought I'd mention genetics as well. And so genetics is something that's come in the last, well, particularly C9orf72 in the last few years. And so we knew before that some families seem to have a higher tendency to get these diseases. And we particularly might think of testing for genes if people are very young when they get affected. And so, unfortunately, because dementia is common, then you do just by random chance get young people that are affected that don't have a genetic cause in the family. But sometimes it's because that there's one of these very strong genes. So as I spoke about at the beginning, that some people have such strong genes, so that we call them dominant genes, that if you carry that gene and you live long enough, then you will get the disease. Whereas other breast cancer genes or different genes, you don't just need the gene, you also need bad luck in other ways or environment, but these genes are a bit different. And so there's a lot of work now, we start off doing a lot of the genetic counselling. We work very closely with the genetic counsellors about talking to people who know there's a gene in their family, about whether or not they would want to, at a much younger age than they develop the disease, whether they would want to know they were going to develop it, because we can give them that information. And actually, what I think is quite interesting is that half the people we send to genetic counselling who think they want to be tested at a young age to find out whether they've got the gene don't choose to have the gene. So it's an entirely personal choice, and people do different things within one family. So just because someone's sibling goes for the genetic test doesn't mean they need to do it. And, it's entirely up to kind of each person what they want to do with that information, but we just have the information there if people want to pursue it. And so because you inherit one of these genes from each parent, then if your parent definitely has the genetic form, there's a 50% chance of each person in the next generation having inherited that gene. But one of the things that we are doing now, which we weren't able to do before, is looking at things like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So people who, of the next generation, might want to have children can go and say, I've got this gene in the family and I want to make sure that my child would not have this gene. And so you go through an IVF-like process, and they can say that that child will not carry that gene. And so that's what we get quite a lot of questions about that in clinic as well. And so I thought I'd talk for the last section on some of the research I've been involved with. Oh, sorry. So I'm not involved in that, but from my understanding, they can. What you mean? How does the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis actually work, or how does the genetic counselling work?
How would you, if you're a child and your parent has it, genetically how do you carry that?
Oh, it's a blood test. So if you know the gene in the parent, then you can you test for the same gene in the child. So yeah. So I thought I'd talk about some of the research I've been involved with. And so this is Ravel, who's a composer, and he's one of the more famous people who's had frontotemporal dementia. And he he had, and we don't know exactly what type, but there has been papers written from here which have argued that he had maybe the genetic form and the progranulin form. And he had problems expressing himself with his speech output. And he had problems with one arm and one hand that he couldn't write properly as the disease developed. And so you can see here, this is his handwritten notation when he was unaffected, extremely meticulous, extremely neat. And then this is as he began to get affected, you can see that it's much more cramped, there's lots of mistakes, he's obviously having difficulty using his hands. But what was really interesting about him is that he could go to his concerts even when he was very affected by the disease and had really limited verbal output, and he'd be able to show people when they played one duff note or did not do his music as he'd wanted it. And so that is sort of one of the first examples probably of, in these diseases, how the language networks and pathways are quite separate from the music networks and pathways. And we've taken that further, and particularly Professor Warren, who I work with, does a lot of work on using music as a non-verbal way to tap into exactly the same processes that you use when you're deciphering language, because music is as complicated as language, but just doesn't have words, so it's going through this different route. And if I show you, this is the parts of the brain that are involved when you're listening to music. And so if you think about it, then there's lots of different things. So when you hear a melody, you think of things like what, the pitch of the melody, the rhythm, the tempo, and what instruments are playing it. Have you heard it before? Do you recognize it? Where were you last when you heard it? Do you like it? And all these different areas come into play. So it's this whole network across the brain that becomes active and comes online when you're listening to music. And so we can use that to understand what processes are still working without having to rely on language, which we know is often affected. And we can show that actually really complex decisions can still be made about music just because we're not relying on the words. And the other thing I don't know, we commonly see it in these conditions, and we're trying to find out why, is that people actually find music hyper rewarding. So it becomes really beyond what, when language was working normally, then, often people say they like music, but they develop something, or some people develop something called musicophilia, which people, a real abnormal craving, where just love of music. And so, and we think it's, might be partially to do with the fact that that you can still get as much pleasure from breaking down music and accessing it, because you're still able to process it to this high level, which language no longer gives that to you. So lots of people find in clinic, we often have people who are really impaired when they're trying to speak, but their families say they go to choirs or music therapy and can still sing quite fluently, and we hear that again and again. And so music can be a very useful, sort of rewarding and enjoyable experience to use when language starts to get affected. And this is some work I was doing on humour in this group of diseases, because as I said before, it's very difficult to try and measure social and behavioural things. How do you put a number to how people interact with other people? But what people had said to us in clinic, and this is what a lot of the work we do is coming from you. So when you tell us things that, and we see sort of patterns where a lot of people are saying the same thing, then we can take it forward and do research on it and see if there's something scientific in it and something we can use to measure. And so what people were saying, that sense of humour was affected very early on. And I was discussing with my supervisor, Professor Warren, and we were saying that actually humour is a very complex thing for your brain to have to do. So you have an expectation of what's going to happen, and then suddenly something happens that deviates from that, and you get surprised, and then your brain quickly works through lots of different scenarios with the same information and thinks, was there something I didn't expect that makes it all make sense? And then you work that out. And actually that whole process, we do it all the time without even thinking about it, is really complicated. And the other thing about humour is it's one of the ways we use to connect with people around us. So if that starts to get affected, either if you don't understand jokes people are making to you or you can't make jokes anymore, then actually that will have a profound effect on your social interactions in a disease which we know affects them anyway. And some of the work we've been doing was looking at I don't know if I can't see anyone who is involved directly in having to look through all my cartoons that I've drawn, but we did questionnaires where we were asking people about humour preferences and how they've changed over time, and there was a real shift in people's humour, what they liked, to quite slapstick, more slapstick humour, and a shift in their humour taste, which actually, from the work we were doing, looked like it was happening, that we could pick up changes that we could actually measure years before we were able to definitely say they had the disease. And so one of the things we're looking into is if we ask about humour and change in humour, is this a very, very early sign of the diseases developing? Because particularly as in the genetic groups and as drug trials are being developed, then we're not really looking at reversing the disease once it's occurred, but more halting it in its tracks. So the earlier, the better, really, when you catch these things for trying out new treatments. And so that was all I was going to say, but I'm very happy to answer any questions. And I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone for
Thank you very much.